and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today, our guest from London is Alex Kokcharov. He is a political risk analyst with his focus on the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, in particular Belarus, and he works with this topic for over 15 years. Alex, welcome.
Hello.
And we will speak today on what has happened to Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko recently. Alex, can we say for sure that Lukashenko still holds the power?
Well, based on everything we know, Lukashenko probably still very much holds the power in Belarus, but there have been reports which cannot be independently verified that he has been dealing with health issues. We all know that when he went to Moscow on 9th of May, he didn't look particularly well, and there have been reports that he may have been hospitalized or he may have undergone serious treatments, medical treatments, but we obviously cannot verify this information. But anyway, these reports have led to rumors that he might be very unwell, leading to questions about what's next for Belarus.
Well, Lukashenko is controlling his country, Belarus, as a dictator for almost 30 years, the longest serving dictator in Europe. And he has built his country like totally centralized on his person. Does this mean that everything in Belarus depends personally on him?
Yes, Belarusian political system is incredibly centralized. I would even say that it's more centralized than Russia. It's a fairly small country with population of just over 9 million people. It's geographically fairly small, and there has been very significant level of control by Lukashenko himself, who has been handpicking officials for nearly 30 years. He came to power in July 1994, and we are approaching 29th anniversary.
And please tell us, like, where did all these rumors came from that he's ill, that he could have been poisoned, and other theories? Is not he an ally of Vladimir Putin?
We obviously, do not know what's going on because we didn't have access to his medical records, but he looked visibly unwell during the Russian so-called victory parade on 9th of May in Moscow, and he has been photographed with his hands bandaged in the days following this, and there have been reports citing Belarusian opposition figures claiming that they have insider information about his alleged hospitalizations and him seeking urgent medical treatments. Again, there is no way to verify this information. We don't know what exactly is going on with him. And we also obviously know that out of all people in Belarus, Lukashenko has access to best medical and healthcare services. And if he needs to, he can also use services in Russia, most probably. And I would be skeptical that Russia would be behind it, because to deal with a succession crisis in Belarus now, when things are not going so well for the Russian army during its invasion in Ukraine, would probably be not the best timing.
Before we come further to the topics of how Russia managed to integrate Belarus into its political and economic system, and how important is Belarus for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe, and write your comments in the commentary section. Well, Alex, coming back from the rumors of health issue of Lukashenko and why his allies, like his former foreign minister Mackay suddenly died, which gave ground for the rumors, can we come back to the basics, and will you explain us what is the meaning of Belarus for Russia and for Vladimir Putin?
Yes, Belarus is the only country in Europe which is allied with Russia. and it is linked with Russia by multiple treaties, some of which are bilateral, such as the Union State, and some of which are multilateral, including the Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union, which also include a few other post-Soviet states, but they are in Asia: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Tajikistan. Belarus has been the only reliable ally for Russia in recent years in Europe, and it's largely due to the fact that Belarus is politically and economically and financially so dependent on Russia. Lukashenka opted for a Russia-centered policy back in 1990s, when he was most probably expecting that the integration process would lead to him being elevated to positions of power in Moscow.
But may I interrupt you? Wasn't it the smart balancing between the EU and Russia? Wasn't it he was trying like to get all the profits from the both centers of power?
It was a lot of back and forth. So yes, Lukashenka centered on Russia, but also was developing relations, especially trading relations with the West. And for a period of time, he benefited from the ability to having access to cheap Russian oil and gas, but also exporting refined products to the European Union. There was a lot of back and forth. There were periods of ups and downs where Belarus was able to rebalance its policy at least somewhat. But, politically, it was, under Lukashenko, he was always saying, we are going to be integrating with Russia. We're going to be building close links with Russia. He was always critical of the West. He was particularly critical of accession of neighboring countries into NATO and EU. His anti-Western rhetoric is very well known. So for Russia, Belarus is the only ally in Europe. For Belarus, it's a source of, it's a big market, and it's a source of economic and financial and political assistance to the government. For Russia, it's also very important because Belarus is, can be described as a balcony into Europe, Russian balcony into Europe, through which Russia can project its political influence and military power.
For Russia, it was not that cheap to keep Lukashenko in line. You have mentioned this oil situation when Belarus got crude oil, refined it, and sold further. And if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, this process costed Vladimir Putin like a huge amount of tax money, like he could not collect at home. He practically financed Lukashenko, isn't it?
Yes. Belarus was receiving both direct assistance from Russia, including loans, which were later written off, but also indirect assistance, which included Belarus being able to purchase Russian crude oil at domestic Russian prices, and then exporting the refined oil products elsewhere, mostly to Europe, at international prices, and gaining the difference was very lucrative business in previous years.
So that developed like two bilateral interests. Vladimir Putin got like his balcony into Europe, as you said, and Alexander Lukashenko got like his state-run economy subsidized by Russia. But everything like not ended, but like got cracks in 2020 when Lukashenko went to his sixth elections, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, 2020 was obviously a watershed. It was basically marked by a popular uprising, the largest protest movements in modern Belarusian history. Protests in Minsk reached 350,000 at one time. The estimated overall number of people who have taken to streets across Belarus immediately after the election was nearly 1 million people, which is a very impressive figure for a country of 9 million people. And legitimacy of the Lukashenko administration has been eroded as the Western countries have not acknowledged him as legitimate president ever since. So fundamentally, he is a de facto ruler, a de facto president. He presides over the country, but his legitimacy is internationally is very partial. He is recognized by Russia, its allies in, say, Central Asia, also by China and some countries in the global South, but he's not recognized by major Western countries, including immediate neighbors of Belarus, such as European Union, but also its member states, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and he's no longer recognized by Ukraine, which is also a very important development.
That is like incredible development. We have observed all these demonstrations you have mentioned and brave fight of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who represented the will of Belarusians to change the government. And it was amazing how she said that she doesn't want to stay president. The only thing she wants to do is to organize the next fair elections. And that was maybe what inspired Belarusians to vote for her. But after that, after the crackdown on peaceful protest, Vladimir Putin seems to, at least militarily, integrated Belarus into his power structure. And that helped Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine, not only from Russia, but also from Belarus, which wasn't the case before. So how is Belarus a part of a Russian war machine against Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely. After the events of 2020, any rebalancing between Russia and the West was no longer possible, and Belarus automatically went, towards Russia, which basically forced a transfer of a quite significant portion of sovereignty from Minsk to Moscow. And it wasn't just purely militarily, but also economic and financial. But militarily, Belarus definitely got much more integrated with the Russian military structures. It's not obviously, fully integrated, but the developments which have been continuing over the past 2 years, they led to an establishment of a joint, the so-called joint regional grouping of forces, which is bilateral Russian and Belarusian. And yes, back in February 2022, Belarusian territory was the launching pad for the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, who marched towards Kiev unsuccessfully, but causing significant damage and raising much more significant questions about, what happens if Belarus joins this war as well directly.
Can Belarus join this war? Does Lukashenko have enough manpower to give them for the Russian invasion and to most probably sacrifice them?
Belarusian armed forces are fairly small. I've seen estimates by military experts who say that the combat-ready forces are probably in the region of 13 to 18,000 people, which is not a very large force. And I think politically for Lukashenko to be joining the war at this stage, when Russian forces have not been doing particularly well in Ukraine, and when the warfare is actually spilling onto Russian territory, would be politically very dangerous, because I think if there would be a direct intervention by Belarusian forces into Ukraine from Belarusian territory, now Ukraine would not be timid and would be conducting strikes well behind the border in order to disrupt logistics and to destroy military assets such as ammunition depots, fuel depots, and military bases on Belarusian territory. Potentially, the UAV attack on Machulishchi airbase near Minsk was a warning to Lukashenko administration about this.
That is what happened like about 3 months ago when
Yes. Yeah.
unidentified, not, it was not drones. I think it was like a
It was a
sabotage group.
it was a drone, so it was a UAV, which caused some damage to a Russian reconnaissance aircraft, which was stationed there, and it forced the evacuation of that aircraft back into Russia for repairs. We don't know who launched it, but irrespective of who launched it, it was probably a warning signal to Lukashenko to not join the war directly.
Indeed, and while the Russian, while the units consisting out of Russian nationals backed by Ukraine are operating repeatedly on the territory of Russia, like in Belgorod region, in other regions. Of course, one can imagine like some groups who can also like enter Belarusian territory, and we may not forget that a lot of Belarusian industry, really important industry areas are directly on the border to Ukraine, like the Mother refinery, oil refinery, which is just coming like 40 or 30 kilometers from the Ukrainian borders, and that they could be soft targets for such groups. Indeed, but we have now nuclear arms have been stationed to Belarus. Can you elaborate on these? Like, is it just a political game, or is it something which we need to take into consideration?
Obviously, it's an escalatory pathway to place nuclear weapons outside of Russian territory for the first time since the 1990s. And it's a clear signal to the West to not directly interfere on Belarusian territory and to Ukraine as well. But again, I didn't think that it would necessarily stop Ukrainian response in case of a direct invasion from Belarusian territory. And as you correctly said, there are a lot of Belarusian nationals fighting on the side of Ukraine in special Belarusian units. They're currently deployed mostly in the east of the country, in Donetsk region, particularly near Bakhmut. But they can be redeployed for the protection of the northern border of Ukraine. And they do have a political objective of eventually overthrowing Lukashenko. So yes, they can be also redeployed, and they can go into Belarusian territory, and a lot of important industrial and logistical assets, such as major railways, are located very close to the border. Regarding the nuclear weapons, very escalatory pathway. We don't know whether nuclear weapons actually have crossed the border. We've seen statements to this effect, but we cannot independently verify it for obvious reasons. Some of the military experts are skeptical that it has happened because the protocols for storing nuclear weapons are very serious, and they require very proper technical preparation. You need to have the facilities for storage, which have to which have to be built to a certain standard. And it looks not particularly feasible that they could have been built in Belarus in such a short period of time between the initial announcement of a possibility of this happening back in March and the announcement of the actual transfer in May. So possibly yes, possibly it's just a disinformation campaign.
Yes, it's amazing. And before we are going further to other important questions, like, for example, how will Belarus look after Lukashenko? Please don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to our channel, and write your comments into the commentary section. Alex, we know that for Ukraine, the development in Belarus after 2020 was a hard way. Like, there was not a social consensus. are these protests to be supported fully also by the government, or should trade take place further? We know Ukraine bought electricity from Belarus even after 2020, and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was not recognized by Ukraine immediately. And even now, there are serious concerns among many Ukrainians. Are Belarusian opposition leaders, are they real allies of Ukraine, or should they be addressed like with a sort of like skepticism because they don't have any influence now or effective influence in Belarus? How do you see the development of these relations between Ukraine and, I don't say Minsk, but the Belarusian people?
Um, it's a complex relationship, of course, because the the Lukashenko administration obviously is supportive of Russia's war effort. Russian missiles are still launched from Belarusian territory even in 2023, and I understand that to a lot of people in Ukraine, it's a source of unease and of negative sentiments. But at the same time, people who live in Belarus are very much split on this. Yes, there is a percentage of population in Belarus which is exposed to Russian propaganda channels and which buys the narratives provided by the Kremlin propaganda at face value, but a lot of people do not believe it. The Belarusian opposition, which is in exile, is strongly pro-Ukrainian. And if, say, in 2020, there may have been some uncertainty about, where, say, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's views lie on the issues of Russia and Ukraine, but by 2022, it was very, very clear that she is strongly pro-European, she's strongly pro-Ukrainian, and she's strongly anti-Russian because she sees that what Russia does in Belarus and Ukraine. It's part of the larger, bigger picture of Russian imperialist expansion into the lands of the former Soviet and Russian empires, where Russia wants to exterminate all national identity and national culture and language, and replace them with Russianness. So I think by now it's very, very clear that Tikhanovskaya and opposition groups which are around Tikhanovskaya are strongly supportive of Ukraine, and they act in solidarity with Ukraine.
That is exactly what I wanted to ask you as the next question. We know in Ukraine, in Ukraine, the Ukrainian language was preserved by a major part of the population, despite all the attempts of Moscow to erase Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian language. In Belarus, we observe a much deeper level of Russification, with very few people using Belarusian on a daily level, despite the fact that it is officially an official language in Belarus. Can you elaborate here more and explain how did it look like in daily life? I know you lived in Belarus for a longer time.
Yes, Belarus was subject to more Russification than Ukraine. This is partly due to the fact that the urbanization of Belarus was conducted quicker in the post-war years, and but
the post-war, you mean
during the post-war reconstruction, Minsk was the fastest growing big city in the Soviet Union, and there was even a phenomenon called the Minsk effect, because it was growing so fast, and the moving of people from rural areas where they previously used to speak Belarusian to the cities was conducted to the switch by prestige language, because Russian in the Soviet Union was prestige language. If you wanted to have a career, you had to switch to Russian, because if you would be speaking Belarusian, you would be considered a rural person, a backward person, not fit to be living and making a career in the city environments. So this was part of the post-war developments when there was very rapid urbanization happening in Belarus, and people moving from the rural areas were picking up Russian as prestige language in the cities. So cities were rapidly Russifying. But even by the late 1980s, the countryside was still largely speaking Belarusian. And there was a short period of national revival in the early 1990s, which was obviously assisted by the demise of the Soviet Union and gaining independence in 1991. And there was a period of switching the education system towards Belarusian language. But it was interrupted after Lukashenko came to power in 1994. And as he had very strong preference for Russia and for Russian, he stopped it and reversed it. And he actually opted for, I would even say, a more Russophone policy than that policy under the Soviet government. Because under Lukashenko, the countryside also switched to Russian. And as a result, very few people speak Belarusian in Belarus these days. And this was even the case before 2020. After 2020, using Belarusian publicly is inviting the police to arrest you, basically. There have been cases where people were arrested after they spoke Belarusian to each other on a street.
That is incredible. Belarusian is an official language in Belarus, and when you use official language in your own country, you can be arrested as a person who is not loyal enough. That is insane. That is insane. But you said that for Lukashenko and for many people who were Sovietized, switching to Russian was some sort of demonstrating their raising social status. We have observed it in Lukashenko as he repeatedly switched to Russian when he wanted to demonstrate his status, and he has also changed all the state symbols to the Soviet one. We know that the current flag of Belarus is some sort of version of a Soviet flag, and Lukashenko changed it because Belarus had a national flag, white, red, white, and he deliberately changed it in 1990s to the Soviet symbolic. But if we come back to how Lukashenko holds his power, he tried to groom his son as a heir, didn't he?
So Lukashenko operates a very one-person-centered political system where he personally selects and rotates officials from different positions. A lot of the officials which are currently occupying senior posts have been picked by him personally, elevated, which created this loyalty. And then he would move them around, sometimes even different regions, different positions, very different areas of responsibility, because he wants to demonstrate that he's the Tsar. He is the person who can give power, but also can take power at a whim. There have been many instances where people in the government were losing favors and were losing positions and were sent to retirement, and worse, were arrested and were sent to prison. And it started happening in the 1990s, so it's not a new development. But because he's been in power for such a long time, pretty much anyone around him is personally loyal to him. So, for instance, the person who would become the acting president in case of Lukashenko dies suddenly is Natalia Kachanova, who is the chairperson of the upper chamber of the parliament. She was handpicked by Lukashenko from an obscure position as deputy mayor in one of the smaller cities in the north of Belarus. And she was elevated to the positions of deputy prime minister, and then the chief of staff of his administration. And now she is occupying a position which is, at least under the constitution, is position number 2. And this creates very significant loyalty. Yes, what we know about Lukashenko, that he would probably prefer a dynastic succession. He would prefer to pass power within his own family. This has been observed in some other post-Soviet states, including Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan more recently, and potentially will be observed in Tajikistan soon. But the problem is that Lukashenko has three children, three sons, and his preferred son is his youngest. He's only 18, Mikolai. And constitutionally, it would not be possible to pass on power to someone who is so young. So I think if something were to happen to Lukashenko in terms of death or incapacitation, which I have no idea when it would happen, I'm not a medical expert, but if something were to happen to him, I think the most likely scenario would be attempted transfer of power via Kachanova to his eldest son, Viktor.
So you believe that if Lukashenko dies or like gets medically into a medical condition which doesn't let him to continue to be the ruler before Vladimir Putin loses this war, that the power will be succeeded within Belarus, but Belarus will not be consumed by Russia?
I think it would be what would most probably be attempted. I am skeptical that Russia has the opportunity to appoint an external person, who is not part of that system. But Russia would probably have their own preferences in terms of who would they want to see head Belarus. And with Lukashenko, they have had issues in the past. There have been multiple disputes. There have been multiple heated conversations between Lukashenko and Putin in the past. Lukashenko is not an easy ally. That's for sure. So they would want someone more amenable. But it's not necessarily the case that Viktor Lukashenko,
the eldest son,
would not be amenable to be very much, not conflicting. It's not, not a lot is known about him because he's been trying to keep a fairly low profile, despite the fact that he has occupied some significant positions in the administration. But he's not known to be a conflicted person. So he is not known to seek conflict on what we know. Again, he might not be first preference for the Kremlin. They might have other ideas, potentially Roman Holovchenko, who is the current prime minister, who has studied in Russia and who has worked in Russia representing Belarus. But I think there will be options. But, what's sure, Russia would want to have a very significant say in what happens to Belarus after Lukashenko dies. If this happens, if this happens while Putin is in power, Russia would not want to lose Belarus. That's why I think it will be very challenging for other scenarios, such as transfer of power to a more democratic or more European-leaning leader or governments in Belarus, because Russia would want to keep Belarus in its orbit. It has military presence in Belarus, and especially if the nuclear deployment is in place, Russia would want to make sure that they control the person who is the head in Belarus. So sadly, I think that Russia will be very directly involved in the process. But the outcome is uncertain because there is no certain successor. There is no clear successor. What I'm saying about Viktor Lukashenko is what I think is more likely, but we haven't seen any any realistic successor in place, being groomed right now. And potentially Nikolai would be a successor, but he's only 18, turning 19 later this year. So constitutionally, it's not going to work.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much. But this way or another, or I think we both believe that the significant factor in what is going in Belarus in the next years is how Ukraine will go out of this war and how fast Ukraine will achieve the victory over Russia. Because after that happens, the constellation in Moscow and in Minsk will be quite different. Thank you so much. Alex Kokcharov was with us. He's a political risk analyst based in London with his experience of over 15 years working with the countries of the region. And he explained us the mysteries of Belarus and the political process of Alexander Lukashenko. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe our channel, to comment on this video, and wait for the next stunning interviews. That was the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. See you soon.
Thank you.